Wow, what a show! I mean, if you guys were with us live with Patrick and Trevor of Rabbit Island, that was clearly amazing. And then no time to rest, no time to go to the bathroom. We are back on, and I have Dr. Gretchen Goodbody Gringley with me live from the Cayman Island. Good afternoon, Gretchen.
Thank you
How
for
are
having
you?
me. I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Happy World Oceans Day.
Happy World Ocean Day. If you can, yeah, you can stop sharing your screen for a second because we're going to come and meet you, meet you in bigger size. So we can, I would like to, to you to introduce yourself for a little bit before we dive, following you and actually we virtually taking a dive for sure. And we're going to
Sure.
follow the lionfish and follow your studies. Yeah, I have my glasses. I'm going to take my glasses off. There we go. So, yeah, people might see the logo behind you, the Central Caribbean Marine Institute, but like we're talking about Bermuda today. So how come? How come? So you were in Bermuda, now you're in Cayman. What's the connection?
Well, I was in Bermuda for over a decade working at BIOS, but I have only just recently I moved to Grand Cayman in January. So I'm now the director of research at the Central Caribbean Marine Institute.
All right, super. Well, thank you for being with us. Thank you for taking time. And you've been very involved in a project that we're going to mention in a few seconds. But before we go into that, because it's all about ocean, I would like to know if little Gretchen knew she wanted to become a mermaid, a
Yes.
techie mermaid.
I think I've known I wanted to be a marine biologist since I was a tiny little girl. My mom always says it was from birth. So I learned to swim before I was 6 months old. I was in this program called Water Babies. And, they threw me in the pool and I swam the full length of the pool at 6 months and crawled my way out. And I just think I had never really left the water. I've just always wanted to be in the ocean and seeing things in the water and diving deeper.
Yeah, we are water. We are water. So you've been in Bermuda, yeah, for a decade to do several things, but mostly or one of those things was studying the lionfish, right?
That's right.
So that would be awesome if you could take us on a trip to follow the lionfish. Now it's tricky with the lionfish because it's really pretty. Well, it's
Yes,
really
it is.
pretty. It's really nice to see lionfish in the water. We don't like them here in Bermuda, but it's important to understand why we don't like them. Why we don't like them in Bermuda, whereas in other places of the world they're completely fine and they're part of the ecosystem, landscape. But it would be nice to know how it started all in Bermuda and all your work to try to bring that to light and the latest results that you got. So
Sure.
I'm going to let you start sharing your screen
Alrighty.
to follow you. If you guys have questions, I mean, Gretchen is going to you've been diving with a sub, with Robbie in a sub already today. You've done like crazy things. You were on a boat bending, a bird right now. So now she's taking you with like heavy gear and she's taking you take diving. So it's going to be pretty insane. If you guys have questions, put them into the Facebook comments, and if I can, I will pass them on to Gretchen. All right, over to you.
All right. So we're talking about the lionfish today. And as you said, Alex, the lionfish is this really beautiful fish that, a lot of people like to have in their aquarium. I think it was made famous really in the James Bond movie. Of course, for me, it was Naked Gun, as I remember the lionfish in the aquarium, and the guy sticks his hand in there and so mayhem ensues. But so the lionfish is a really well-known species of fish. And because of that, a lot of people had them in their aquaria. And in the 1980s, the lionfish was released into southern Florida. And it's debated as to how exactly the lionfish was introduced. Some say that it was from accidental aquarium dumping, so people that didn't want their fish anymore throwing them overboard. Another theory is that it's related to the hurricane. And so, people's living rooms basically are being destroyed. And so the lionfish being released in that sense. either way, you know, it was a small number of lionfish that were released in the mid 1980s in Florida. And from there, they started to inhabit the entire Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, and the coast of the United States, the eastern coast of the US. We actually found the first lionfish outside of US waters in Bermuda. So we were the first non US location to document a lionfish. And that was in the year 2000. And the fish actually was shown at the ag show. And the people came and saw this fish and they said, "This isn't from here. There are no lionfish here in Bermuda." But sure enough, they had found the lionfish in a tide pool. And from there, we started to see an increasing number of lionfish over time. So the real question is, why is it a bad thing? It's just another marine fish. Why can't he live happily here like all the other coral reef fishes? And the problem is that the lionfish is native to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So it doesn't belong in the Atlantic or the Caribbean. Because of that, things that it eats don't necessarily recognize it as a predator, and things that would eat it don't recognize it as prey. So it's basically able to live unthreatened out on our reefs and eat whatever it wants without having to put much effort. But the interesting thing is that the lionfish is actually a really stealth hunter. So you can see in this picture here, the lionfish stalking these little blue chromis. And it just sits there and waits silently until its prey are close enough that it can open its mouth, and it creates this giant vacuum with its mouth because the cavity inside its mouth is so huge that when it opens, it sucks all the water in, but then also sucks in these tiny little fish that are there as well. Then in the other picture, you can see that all of these tiny juvenile barbers were taken from the stomach of a single lionfish. So they can eat quite a lot in one sitting. And so we think this is probably like within a 24-hour period, it ate all of these little fish. So because of that, the lionfish can have a negative impact on the ecosystem. And that's because it can overeat, it feeds indiscriminately on all different kinds of fish species, and it can impact our fish communities. And so because of this, we've been trying to manage lionfish across the invaded region, which is the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic, by sort of different practices of removal so that we can minimize the negative impact to our fish populations. So I said that the first lionfish was found in Bermuda in 2000 and was shown at the ag show, but we really didn't actually recognize the lionfish as a problem in Bermuda until almost a decade later. So around 2010, 2011. And I would say that one of the champions of the lionfish as an issue in Bermuda was certainly Graham Maddox. So he started up the Ocean Support Foundation along with Ken Vickers and Jeff Gardner. And they created this group of individuals who were concerned about the potential impact of this growing lionfish population in Bermuda. And really one of the reasons that they were the first people to be able to identify this as a problem was because they were diving really deep. So Graham is one of these people that really started the tech diving industry in Bermuda. And so he was doing these really deep, risky dives and was seeing lionfish in numbers that nobody had seen in Bermuda. And everyone was astounded and shocked until he started bringing up some video footage of the numbers that we were looking at. And so it was really Ocean Support Foundation in their initial stages that sort of got together and decided that they were going to form a task force. And so we formed the Bermuda Lionfish Task Force in 2012. And the goal of the task force was to write up a management plan. So to use all of our resources and really get a group of people together that could write this informed management plan on how we as a country were going to tackle the potential impacts that this lionfish population could have. And so that's what we did. So we started out by having a lot of meetings at the aquarium and getting people together, informing the public of this as an issue, and starting to create these events. So one of these events would be, for example, the annual Groundswell Lionfish Tournament, And that really served to raise awareness in Bermuda in the early days about lionfish as a problem. So here we are, you know, the Lionfish tournament has been this amazing opportunity to reach the general public, to show them what a lionfish looks like. So often at the Groundswell tournaments, we'll have the table set up so that people can see us dissecting fish. We can show them the different parts of the lionfish, in particular the venomous spines, and how to safely handle lionfish. Because as you may know, the lionfish is venomous. So the dorsal spines and the anal spines and the pelvic fins all have venomous glands. So if you accidentally puncture yourself with one of these fins, it can leave a nasty sting. So teaching the public how to deal with that was really important. But also just raising awareness on what we can do as a community to reduce the impact. And so, as I said, Graham was also really an instigator in getting people to join him in tech diving, to go down there and help mitigate the impacts of the lionfish on these deep reef sites, what we call mesophotic reefs. So you can see Graham here all geared up in his technical gear. So in order for us to dive to these depths, when we first started out, we were each of us wearing 2 tanks on our back and 2 tanks on our side. So 1 tank on either side. And sometimes, we would carry 1 or sometimes 2 of these large containers. They're called zookeepers. They're basically this giant PVC pipe with a funnel at the top. And so when we spear a lionfish, we can then shove the lionfish into this container, and it is safely held, and it won't puncture through this PVC and accidentally poke us or anyone else. So this is a safe way for us to contain all the fish that we catch as we come back up to the surface. So we were actually, this was in 2014, the images here, when we had a pretty good sized team of us. So the 4 to 6 tech divers would go down and clear out the reef of all the lionfish. But because
it's so cool listening to you, Gretchen, that I'm barely wanting to interrupt, because you're unfolding, the story. And
I'm like, is she gonna ask me something?
I was like, well, you know what? I was like, no, because she's going to. I don't know. I'm just captivated. So it's cool. I think it was important when we mentioned at the start that the the lionfish was invasive here, because a lot of people don't know. They know the lionfish, and if people are watching us from other places, they don't realize, because for us, for example, in Europe, you go dive in the Red Sea and the lionfish is there. It's part of the ecosystem and it's completely normal. So the fact that, because they don't have, predators and the prey don't recognize them as being a predator, then it's a whole different problem. And plus they lay eggs like crazy. So
they do. They can lay up to 30,000 eggs every 4 days.
Yeah, imagine that.
So that is remarkable. That's one of the things I've been thinking about. So here in Cayman, we're still not allowed to scuba dive. We haven't been allowed in the water since mid-March. And I just wonder, every 4 days, are those lionfish out there breeding? And what is the population of lionfish going to be like when we're finally allowed back in the water here? I do think, at least in Bermuda, people are still out there snorkeling and removing lionfish all the time. We have a really healthy culling population of free divers that go out religiously to catch lionfish. And I think that's made a huge impact in all of our efforts. So I salute all of you who are out there free diving, continuously removing lionfish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no. So once we wrote this management plan, the task force, the first sort of step in our management plan was we had to know where the lionfish were and how many of them there were in order to effectively manage the population. So to address that, we actually were able to get some funding from the UK government from a project called the Darwin Plus Initiative. And this was a great starting point for us. It was myself, Joe Pitt, Robbie Smith, and Corey Eddy, and Ocean Support Foundation, of course. And we set out to survey 15 sites across the platform at 5 different depths at each site. And so you can see in the map here all of the sites that we were able to end up surveying throughout our project. And this was in 2013 that we did these surveys. So this, again, is one of those things we were using regular scuba diving at our shallow sites, but then our entire team, so myself, Corey, and Alex, the 4 of us were the tech team, and so we could go down and do fish surveys and remove lionfish from the 45 and 60 meter depth zones.
So did you mention, Gretchen, and maybe you did, but what do you call take dive? Like, what's the depth that normal people on normal air tank should dive to? You know, and from what depth do you call take dive?
So I consider a technical dive any dive in which you go into decompression. So in which you have to start taking decompression stops on your way up in order to reduce the probability of getting bent. Any dive that basically includes additional planning beyond your traditional dive table. So you can't just jump in with your computer and follow your computer and be done with the dive. I would consider a technical dive. But in general, your open water certification or even your advanced open water certification is going to allow you to get to roughly 120, 130 feet. Anything deeper than that, you need additional training to do. And usually you'll need to dive on mixed gases. So either nitrox or trimix that will allow you to go deeper while reducing the probability of getting bent.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah. I mean, I just think of it anything that requires more planning. If you need to think about it technically, then it's a technical dive. There's also a lot more risk involved with a technical dive. You're usually carrying a lot more equipment. There's other things to think about in terms of your gas mixes, what you can breathe at different depths, when oxygen becomes toxic, that sort of thing, which you don't normally even have to think twice about on a normal open water dive. Right. So when we started these surveys, we didn't we had an idea we were going to find more lionfish on the deep sites, but we were quite shocked by what we found. So I'm going to try not to overwhelm everybody with data, but I have to show a little bit of data. You know, I'm a scientist after all. So I think these results were really interesting. So we found, in fact, that there was an exponential increase of lionfish at 60 meters depth compared to all of the other depth zones that we surveyed. So there were very few fish at 10 meters depth, at 20 meters depth, at 30 meters depth. But when we started to get to 45, we started consistently finding lionfish. And when we got to 60 meters, that's when we found these extreme hot spots. But also I want to point out that in these initial surveys in 2013, 2014, we still didn't find these extreme high numbers at every single site at 60 meters. So if you look at the map here, we have our little pictures of lionfish all around the island. And the size of the lionfish in this picture is relevant to the number of lionfish that we saw at that location. So for example, the site Tiger and XL have a big lionfish because these are our 2 main hotspots. They had a very high number of lionfish. XL, for example, was on the order of about 1,000 lionfish per hectare. But then the sites on the North Shore, like Angel, Dark Slime, North Rock, and Real Sticky, we found very few to no lionfish, even at the 60-meter depth zone. So this does differ a lot by site. And what we found with this study was that we think it's related to food availability. So they'll go to places where there's a lot of food available, and we think it's related to ocean currents bringing in nutrients that then cycle through the system and basically feed the food chain. So we thought, okay, well, at least there are these areas of refuge where the lionfish hasn't been able to really establish these hot spots. So, you know, let's focus, at least with our management, we know now where to focus our efforts. And it was at 60 meters, and it was at 2 particular sites. And so moving forward, we really did try to focus our work, particularly on XL, because it's easier to get to than Tiger. I mean, BIOS, of course, is located Ferry Reach, and that's where we're operating out of. So getting all the way down to Tiger was quite an effort for us. So we did a lot of work at Excel moving forward. And the reason is that this is what Excel looked like in 2014. So you can see it's just basically blanketed with lionfish at this 60-meter depth. And so, when we would go down onto these dives at Excel, even just two of us diving and we're down there for 20 minutes and we would remove more than 50 fish between the two of us. So that's, every 30 seconds we're catching a fish. And that's pretty remarkable when you think about, how much effort it takes oftentimes to find just a single fish when you're out free diving off the shore.
Have many people seen those images, Gretchen?
I think OSF really tried to spread the word about how many lionfish there were. I've showed these images at a few different conferences, particularly working with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. But I'm not sure if it's really well known how drastic or how dense the populations are at some of these sites. So because we knew now that there were these extreme hotspots that we needed to target, we actually moved into rebreather diving instead of the open circuit. So I said before, in the early days we're diving with two giant tanks on our back and one tank under each arm. So each person carrying 4 scuba cylinders. We transitioned to rebreathers because it enabled us to go deeper. It enabled us to stay at depth longer, and it minimizes the amount of time that it would take us to surface after a dive. So minimizing our decompression requirement. And this is because the rebreather actually has a computer system in it, which is regulating how much oxygen is in the system. So when I'm diving with a cylinder on my back, I am breathing the gas that I've put into that cylinder. The concentration of oxygen changes with depth because of the pressure change and how that affects partial pressure of the different gases. But the mix of gas doesn't change throughout the dive. When you're diving a rebreather, it's actually injecting oxygen into the system in order to make sure that you have the right partial pressure of oxygen, no matter how deep you are. And one of the key things about this is as you start to ascend and do your decompression, it's still maintaining the highest possible oxygen concentration to minimize that decompression time. And so this is why it results in lower decompression requirement. So we can go deeper, stay longer, less decompression. All in all, it's a great thing. It's also financially a really good thing because helium is expensive. And so when we were diving trimix in open circuit, the cost of helium made every dive, very expensive for us. I think it was $150 a diver or something just for the gas per dive. And then when we started going to rebreather, it was less than a third of that per dive.
So I'm just going to chip in there. I mean, rebreather are very useful, but you definitely have to learn how to use them. You definitely have to really be careful when you use them. You have to check your rebreather if it hasn't been used. You have all these things to do because of the buildup of the carbon dioxide that you can get into the system. There
is a lot of risk associated with diving a rebreather, and we have in fact had some accidents with people we know and love in Bermuda. So
I just wanted to make sure that for the especially the younger, older ocean lovers, like scuba lovers, we have to be very careful with rebreather.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of training that goes into it. So for myself, I started with the open circuit tech diving in 2013, and I started on a rebreather in 2016. So it took me a few years to get up to the point that I was comfortable switching to a rebreather. And then even then I was only doing shallow dives for about a year before we started actually training with different instructors to go deeper. So we brought in people from abroad that would train us to do the kind of diving that we wanted to do on a rebreather. So yeah, there was a lot of training, a lot of practice, a lot of hours underwater, getting used to the system and learning how it works, for sure. But I love the rebreather now. One of the coolest things that I think about diving on the rebreather is how quiet it is underwater. And I never actually realized how loud we are as scuba divers until there were no bubbles. And you can hear all these little clicks and grunts and snapping sounds, and it's like, oh my gosh, the reef is really noisy. I just couldn't hear it before because I was so loud.
We had a free diving session earlier on in the day, at Gretchen. So yeah, we don't need a rebreather. We can just free dive.
Yeah.
Deep, but you know what? Beth can go to 50, 60 meters. She can,
That's true. Beth has the same experience, right? She just doesn't have to carry 150 pounds of gear with her every time.
You get that sense of freedom. But yeah, no, let's keep that. Let's keep hearing the rest of the story.
Yes. So we got our rebreathers, and then we were able to do a lot more of the diving and focus on these 60-meter sites. So the next thing that we did was we wanted to see, we were seeing how effective the shallow water cullers are. So all those people that are out there free diving and scuba diving in the shallows on South Shore and removing fish very frequently. We think that's why we don't see very many lionfish in the shallows in Bermuda, is because they are so effective at removing lionfish. And so one thing that we did was we decided to focus on just this one hotspot, XL. And we went there every single month for 6 months, and we would go down and count how many lionfish were there. And then we would take them all, we would remove them all. Then we'd go the next month and do the same thing. So this is what, if you look at this graph in red on the bottom, this is showing how many lionfish we were counting at this XL site every month. And you can see that it goes down. Every single month we went back, the number of lionfish was less and less and less. And even so, we stopped in December with our 6-month culling. And we went back in May, and the numbers were still low. And then we removed the lionfish in May and went back again in January, almost 8 months later, and still the numbers were low. And so this indicated to us that manually removing the lionfish from this hotspot was actually effective at maintaining the population at these really low levels. And so there's been some work that said that if you can maintain the lionfish density below 75% of the carrying capacity, that this will minimize the impact, and that we surpassed that 75% by October of 2017. So by the 4th time we went, we had met the threshold. So that's an indication that hitting a hotspot hard and often will be effective at minimizing this population. And another thing that you can see then is the next project we started was we wanted to reassess these sites that we had done in 2014. So in 2019, I worked with Robbie again, and we were really lucky to be funded by BZS and the Lionfish Task Force. And we went out and resurveyed these sites at the same depths. And so the top graph here, the light orange is the 2014 density of lionfish, and the dark orange is the 2019 lionfish density. And you can see that lionfish density actually increased at every site significantly, except for XL, which is the site that we were out there removing lionfish.
Very clearly.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
So first of all, this again shows that still, months later after the last time we'd removed lionfish from XL, their numbers were still low, and it had a significant impact on the overall density at that site. But what else is important here is that these data are showing that we're starting to get an influx of lionfish populations at these North Shore sites where we didn't have them 5 years ago. So it does mean that the lionfish population is still growing and expanding. It's still a problem, and it's something that we do still need to deal with and tackle. And particularly our data shows that we can in fact manage it with concerted effort. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think it's really the problem. Like it's like once they're there, if we don't remove them, they're not going to go anywhere. It's not like it's not like you clean.
They're going to breed with each other and make more.
Yeah. All right. So either is there like, because going tech diving and trying to cull them and collect them is as you say, it's expensive. It's very heavily on the tech side. Is there other methods or like other things that you guys have tried to experiment, or where are we going on in that direction? Like, is there any hope?
Yeah. So we have tried a few different things. So when we first started this project with the Darwin Initiative, we were working with Joe Pitt and Tammy Warren, and we were able to test these traps. So we initially started with modified lobster pots, and we started this with this method because we were getting reports from the lobster fishermen that they were catching lionfish in their pots, and so we wanted to see if we could modify it to reduce the bycatch of fish and increase the catch of lionfish. So if you see in this picture, if you look really closely, you can see that there are a few lionfish in this trap. And so, you know, the lionfish were going into the lobster pots, but they, you know, we were also catching some other fish as well. So it wasn't completely without bycatch. And it was a lot of effort. And it didn't seem that we had really motivated the fishermen to switch from using the pots for lobsters to lionfish. And that's really a financial conversation, I think. We've also tried a modified clamshell trap. So in the other pictures here, you can see the clamshell trap on the boat here. And then when we drop it down into the water, it opens up. So as it hits the bottom of the ocean, the whole thing opens up and reveals this fish aggregation device. So this project was funded by the BEST project, which is from the EU. And we were working with Tim Noyes at BIOS on this. So he was the one who really built all these traps. And we deployed them out at our hotspots to see if they would catch lionfish as well. The idea being that the lionfish is attracted to structure, and there's a lot of this sort of very flat expanse at depth. And so we thought, you know, the lionfish would come to this aggregation device and just sit there. And as you pull the line, the clam shape closes and is thought to capture the lionfish within it. So as you pull the trap up. Unfortunately, we didn't have a whole lot of success with this. One of the main problems is, you know, at the depth that we were working at was really difficult to deploy and retrieve traps. We tried multiple different ways in which we could go retrieve our traps without having to have a line on the surface, those sorts of things. And so, you know, in the end, it did still seemed more effective for us to just dive down and catch them than this trap. But they are having some luck with this particular trap in Florida. So they are, you know, it seems like they might be more useful in sandy bottom environments where there's not a strong current, but not necessarily here in Bermuda.
Okay.
And then some other things that we've tried, we worked with robots in service of the environment to develop a lionfish ROV. So that's this picture on the bottom here. You can see we worked with iRobot to develop this, and it has two paddles that send like an electronic field through them and stun the lionfish, and then it sucks the lionfish into the little container. You know, there's some drawbacks with this particular design in that the container's quite small. It can only hold a few fish at a time. It's tethered to the boat. It's operated like a PlayStation, so you can be looking at a video screen and operating the robot. But they are working on ways to use facial recognition so that it can be an autonomous robot instead of tethered, and can actually identify lionfish on its own, roaming around. The concept behind this particular robot too is to make it financially feasible that, you know, your average sport fisherman could go buy one of these and, you know, for a fun afternoon, go try and catch lionfish with it.
That's interesting that you mentioned like the recognition of like trying to, you know, to recognize and not being manned, because we had Andrew talking about whales, you know, earlier on, and you know, there's like the trying to get the tech to be able to like match the flukes, you know, and not doing it manually. and it's not easy as it seems to try to get those recognition and those things working. So if there's any like engineer robotics, growing up, and they say, I really want to get, myself into ocean studies. I mean, definitely the programming and the computer and that part of things is very important. And I think it's going to become more and more prominent, right?
Oh, most definitely. And like just the design and engineering components of how you design a robot or a trap that's going to be efficient in different environments is really sort of the next step. So I also wanted to talk about the other robot that we've worked with, which is with Atlantic Lionshare, and they developed the Reef Sweeper. Similar to the iRobot version, it's tethered to the surface, but this particular system is huge. So this is a large ROV, and you can see the basket on the underside where it collects the fish. So it can collect, upwards of 50 fish in a dive versus just a couple. And at the similarly, it's, operated by a person who's on the boat looking at video screens. So there's a camera on the ROV, and you're guiding where the ROV is going, and it uses lasers to then guide its spear and catch the lionfish. So I have a video of it at work. So we went down and videoed the Reef Sweeper in action, trying to catch a lionfish. You'll see the operators trying to line up the two lasers on the lionfish, and then it's going to shoot it with a spear just there. And then it pulls the lionfish back up. And again, there's like a vacuum device that sucks up the lionfish so it's not able to swim out, and it goes into its container. So this is pretty cool little machine, and they've actually taken the Reef Sweeper to Florida and are testing it out in areas where there are more dense populations of lionfish to see if it can be used commercially by commercial fishermen.
Well, would you say that Bermuda is not in the state that some of the islands in the Caribbean might be? Like, do we have less lionfish, and some of the places in the Caribbean are much more facing much higher numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say that, especially the Gulf of Mexico and Florida. They have huge numbers of lionfish. I mean, you're talking at their 1 to 2 day tournaments, they're pulling out thousands of fish.
Yeah.
Whereas we're pulling out hundreds. So there's definitely a difference in the densities of lionfish between these locations. And I think that one of the reasons we think that we have sort of been lucky with the densities is that they don't appear to reproduce in the winter months in Bermuda. So some of Corey's dissertation work was looking at the reproduction of the lionfish throughout the year. And he found that they were not as reproductively active in the winter months in Bermuda because it's cold. So that's important, because if we get this break of reproduction where they're not producing new individuals, then that's probably one reason that we're able to manage our population a little bit easier.
And I think it's very valuable information. There was a question that came up, like, when restaurants open again, where can we go and eat lionfish? So right on. Please.
Good. So we really have tried to get lionfish into the restaurants and into the grocery stores. And I have to say that everyone has, in the past, has been so open to the idea of serving lionfish. One thing that we've sort of gone back and forth on is, what is the price point of a lionfish? How much should we be selling it for? And you think about, if it's two of us going down there in tech gear and risking our lives to catch 50 fish, that's an expensive fish. It's not a fish that you've thrown a trap down and caught 50 fish with very little effort. So I'm not saying that catching fish with traps is a little effort. That's also a lot of work. But because we're catching them, so few of them, and it takes such a concerted effort to get them, we were charging quite a lot of money. So I think that some people found that as a bit of a deterrent because, you're looking at a high-end fish. But at the same time, I talked about the idea of using your lobster pot for lionfish instead of lobster. But if you're getting more money for the lionfish than you are for the lobster, then maybe we can encourage fishermen to potentially opt for going after an invasive fish instead of targeting lobster. So that could be a positive trade-off. So there has to be an economic evaluation of what really is the target price point for lionfish, given the amount of effort that goes into catching it, and the fact that it's a sustainable food source. It's a benefit to the environment to remove them. And so, you're encouraging a positive protein source. So some restaurants, if people want to know where to get lionfish when things open back up, a lot of Marcus's has consistently had lionfish on the menu. I think where
you can think about it, it's one of the questions that came into the comments. So maybe come back to the Facebook page later on and just put in there what you can think about. And I don't know if you were going to mention the freediving community was really active at culling the lionfish as well. So
they are. And in fact, right now I'm no longer in Bermuda, so nobody's going down to these depths to catch lionfish anymore.
Well, plus we can't scuba dive anyway.
Oh, true.
It's prohibited, so yeah.
And so, the lionfish that are coming onto the menus that you see in the stores or any of the restaurants is from freedivers. And so really, again, giving those guys so much credit as they continue to go out there and catch lionfish.
Absolutely. You guys, I'm just going to mention the fact that you need a permit to do that. You need to be 16 to get your permit. But you can be trained at getting your culling permits, and then you go down. You can go out with your your spear and be active. I think it's a great message, and I don't want to cut you short, Gretchen, but I think it's a great message for World Ocean Day that yes, we have a threat, yes, we have an issue, but we can try. We have to keep trying of managing it because it's not going to be something.
And translating that into something positive, which is a delicious protein source.
Absolutely. And it is very, very yummy, guys. If you haven't tried lionfish, please do. And I also wanted to mention that some freedivers have license to sell lionfish. I think there's...
Yeah, you do have to have a special permit to sell. So not everyone who catches lionfish is allowed to sell lionfish.
No, but there's a few people who are able to, so you can maybe ask around you if you know someone who can do that. So yeah. Cool.
And then I just wanted to end with that this is really a regional effort. It's not just isolated into Bermuda. So, we've tried to get the word out through television. So we've had episodes that focused on the lionfish issue in Bermuda on PBS and on BBC. We had a great thing with the America's Cup with 11th Hour Racing. And they put out a video about the lionfish and consuming lionfish. Of course, the annual derbies are really great. So there are several lionfish derbies throughout the year in Bermuda that you can take part in. And then a few of us were really lucky last year, myself, Alex, and Weldon, to get to go on an expedition to remove lionfish with a bunch of other lionfish crazy people in the Gulf of Mexico. So getting to collaborate with other people and learn what's happening with lionfish across the region is another great way to sort of educate the public and get the word out.
I like the crazy people.
The crazy lionfish.
I think we need crazy people. All right, awesome. So, I was just listening and watching, and I completely forgot to see if there's any more questions that came onto the Facebook page. Not that I can see, so I think we are good. One was saying, is there any resistance to the willing of culling? To the culling of lionfish in Bermuda.
I have heard some negative feedback about removing lionfish, and that it deserves to be here as much as any other fish. I would say that the majority of the information from marine ecologists in the invaded region have shown that it has a negative impact, and that we are not eradicating the species at all. What we're doing is maintaining it at a level that it's not going to have a negative impact on the environment. So
and I think it's very important, Gretchen. I've stopped sharing your screen there because it's soon time to part ways. Yep. But I think it's very important when we talk about conservation to understand that we try to protect. we try to conserve, but it doesn't mean that we have to not cull sometimes. You know, it's really the balance between like food source and a certain population of animal. And people are going to say, you know, like that, like, why would you want to kill them? You know, I love fish, I want to protect the fish. So I think it's very important to understand, you know, conservation and controlling, you know, practices. So I think it's a valuable message to pass on to World Ocean Day, because yes, we want to protect them, we want to make sure that, you know, the ecosystem and the food chain is happening, and the diversity that we need is happening. So thank you, Gretchen.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you want to add before we no, we're good. I mean, that was awesome. I mean, I got a kick of like all the tech diving, you know, little details, and the footage was amazing. So you know, just keep diving, keep free diving, keep culling lionfish. If you want to get into science, definitely get into science. So we can, you know, identify those issues, work on them, and then try to act on them. So thank you very much.
And if you want to get into culling lionfish, you can look for the Bermuda Lionfish Culling Program on Facebook and online and get information how to get your permit.
All right. So I'm going to let Gretchen go, and I will see you guys in a few minutes for our last live session of the day. And we're going to talk a little bit about physics and about the ecology of the Sargasso Sea. All right. See you soon. Thank you.